приводу місяця вшанування Голодомору з історичною доповіддю на цю тему Торонто вдруге відвідав відомий історик Єльського університету Тімоті Снайдер, який представив свою нову книжку про Голокост «Black Earth: The Holocaust as History and Warning».
Дорогі глядачі, вітаємо в студії автора Тімоті Снайдер. Mr. Snyder, welcome to our show. Congratulations on the book.
Many thanks.
Let's get into it right away. What's the argument, the main argument that you make in the book, and the lesson that is to be drawn from it that's actually built into the title of the book?
So what I try to do in this book is not talk about the Holocaust as we remember it, but try to understand the Holocaust as it happened. In general, with the Holocaust, we're in a mode where we visualize or we commemorate, but what we actually need to do, I think, above all, is to understand. The argument that I develop has three parts. Like everyone else, I think that Hitler's ideology was important. But what I tried to show is that Hitler's ideology, a kind of global anti-Semitism, could only work under two conditions. The first is a politics of what I call ecological panic, right? People have to believe that something is at stake, that they have to move against other people right now because resources are short, food is short, time is short. And the second condition is what I call statelessness. The Holocaust didn't actually happen in Germany. It could only happen after German power destroyed other states, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and then the attempt to destroy the Soviet Union. The destruction of states created possibilities for experiments. It allowed the Germans to find techniques of killing Jews. So with that three-part argument, we can then look at the world a little bit differently. We don't have to worry only about bad ideas, we should, but we should also worry about states failing, and we should also worry about environmental conditions or the politics of environmental panic.
And then what is the lesson that is to be drawn from that further? What are we supposed to understand different from what we've understood before?
Well, I think the first thing is that we have to see all of these events of the 30s and 40s, including the Holocaust, as a history, right? Not just as a museum exhibit behind plexiglass, but as a history. If you understand that there are multiple causes, then you can look at the events since 1945 and make more sense of them. So other genocides, whether it's before 1945, we can talk about the Holodomor, or after 1945, make more sense if you see these three factors. So Darfur, Rwanda, Syria today, in all of these cases you see some combination of ecological panic and state failure. And so the conclusions that one could draw would be things like this. Don't go around destroying states, especially not in the name of the Holocaust, right? This is why I got so upset about Russian policy, the idea that you could destroy a state and claim that somehow that was a lesson of the Second World War. The lesson of the Second World War is the opposite. You should try to preserve states. And we should do what we can to avoid ecological collapse, right? We should do what we can to take care of the environment, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because if we don't, we create situations of perceived scarcity where we will all behave much worse than we expect.
Mr. Snyder, you, in your previous book, The Bloodlands, you've treated the atrocities in Ukraine. Is there a lesson to be drawn from those also? And is it possible to also to maybe conclude or think that there's a tie-in between the Holodomor in Ukraine, where Hitler may have learned from Stalin how to do genocide?
There certainly is a connection, although I don't think it's as straightforward as that one. When we look at Ukraine, we're looking at a territory where between 1933 and 1945, you have the most dangerous place in the world. More people die as a result of political decisions in Ukraine than anywhere else during the period that Stalin and Hitler are both in power. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that for both the Soviet project and the Nazi project, Ukraine is a kind of motor, it's a source of food for the real Soviet project and for the attempted Soviet project. So it's not a coincidence that Ukraine suffers most under Stalin's 5-year plan, and it's also not a coincidence that when Hitler makes war against the Soviet Union, his main war aim is precisely Ukraine, right? But so the connection is that both from a Soviet position of class struggle and from a Hitlerian position of racial struggle, the territory that you have to control is Ukraine. And that's the connection between the Holodomor and the Holocaust. It has to do, above all, in my view, with territory. The special thing for Hitler was that Hitler saw the Jews as the people who were preventing racial struggle. So from Hitler's point of view, when you make war against the Soviet Union, you're doing two things. You're going to starve, kill, enslave the Slavic subhumans, right, the Ukrainians, and you have to completely eliminate the Jews, because in Hitler's worldview, it's the Jews who stop racial struggle from going forth. So in Hitler's mind, those two struggles against the Slavs and against the Jews are different, but they're related and they happen in the same place. So I'm very much of the opinion that one shouldn't say, let's only talk about the Jews, not the Ukrainians, or let's only talk about the Ukrainians and not the Jews. One shouldn't say, let's use the Holodomor not to talk about the Holocaust, or the Holocaust not to talk about the Holodomor. They were not the same thing, but you can only understand each of them if you have, I think, this broader history in mind.
The Ukrainian community commemorates or reflects on the issues of the Holodomor during the month of November, and you're speaking to the community later on today. Could you maybe summarize the subject of your speech to the community there?
Right. So we've been writing about and thinking about and commemorating the Holodomor for a long time. What I'm going to do this evening, rather than just lay out the history of the event, which I did in chapter 1 of Bloodlands, what I'm going to try to do is make the case, to Ukrainians and others who might come, that the Holodomor is actually a piece of a much bigger history, that it's an example of how Ukraine is actually in the middle of larger trends in world history and has been for a very long time. So there's a tendency to look at the Holodomor and say this is an example of how a nation was repressed. True enough, but in order to understand how it came to that, one has to see how central Ukraine was for, as we were just talking about, dueling Hitlerian and Stalinist views of how to remake the world. And what I'm going to try to show is that that was true before the Holodomor, that was true, and that's true after the Holodomor. That Ukrainian history is actually central to world history, and that's a position that I think might be unfamiliar to Ukrainians, but I hope it's one that will be interesting.
But is it possible that the Ukraine being central to issues right now, fighting a war with Russia, in effect defending global issues, and now we have Syria, now Ukraine seems to be forgotten. What is your message to, let's say, to the Western world and to us? And at the same time, I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you right now, but also it seems that things have almost quieted down in Ukraine. But I can't imagine Putin all of a sudden forgetting about Ukraine and having moved on to Syria.
Right. So here's the big picture as I see it. The big picture as I see it is that the European Union is a kind of rescue zone for states. Okay, so European states can't make it on their own, even the big ones. Even Germany, Britain, France, they can't make it on their own. That's why you have the European Union. The European Union is where you go after you lose your empire, or it's where you go if you used to be part of someone else's empire. And those are the enlargements of 2004, 2007 to Eastern Europe. Ukraine is actually, in a way, normal. In 2013, Ukrainian citizens, when they were protesting on the Maidan, were saying something which was quite normal and true, namely, in order to be a state, we need help from Europe. That's actually true, right? But the converse is also true. Europe only works and only exists insofar as it's attractive to states beyond its borders. So the whole European project depends upon being attractive, and the project of building a Ukrainian state depends upon the European Union existing. It's very important, as I see it, to keep both of those things going, both the European project and the Ukrainian project. From the Ukrainian point of view, war or no war, European interest or no European interest, media interest or no European interest. The most important issue is building up the Ukrainian state from below, the rule of law. That's the most important thing. That has to happen no matter how bad the circumstances are.
We see now that Putin trying to somehow get involved in decision making in the Far East. Where do you see that going, and what do you think Putin's plans are in general? Both in relation to Ukraine and in terms of Europe and everything else that's happening in that area.
Okay, so as I understand it, and I could be wrong, anytime you try to figure out what's happening in the present, you can be wrong, but as I understand it, the basic Russian strategy is a negative one. They don't have a vision about what they're going to be, or when they have visions about what they're going to be, they change them every 6 months or so. But what is fairly consistent is the notion that other people should fall apart. So the transatlantic relationship should fall apart, the European Union should fall apart, NATO should fall apart, Ukraine should fall apart. And basically the Russian strategy, as I see one, is one of, I see it as one of relative power. So Russia can't get much stronger, but it can make other people weaker by breaking apart their relationships. And this is true at the level of state-to-state relationships. I think it's also true of civil society. Trying to discredit civil society as a way of making people you see as your enemies weaker. So, that's the first thing I think to understand about Russian foreign policy, is that it's fundamentally negative in character. And so when I look at Syria, And I watch Russian planes, bombing even more Syrian civilians into refugee status. I can't help but think of the Donbass, and I can't help but think of the willingness of Russia to create 2 million refugees among basically Russian-speaking people, right? If Russia is willing to create 2 million refugees among the people it said it was trying to save in eastern Ukraine, no doubt Russia will be willing to create lots of refugees in Syria. Right? And I think, in fact, that is what's happening. This is a deliberate attempt to drive refugees into Europe and in that way weaken the European Union by strengthening the populist far right. I think that's what they're after as far as Europe is concerned. As far as their own politics are concerned, Russian media is mainly TV, and TV is mainly foreign news, and in foreign news you have to have a happy story. For Russia, Ukraine had ceased to be a happy story. It was becoming harder and harder to portray it as a Russian victory. So it was interesting, 4 weeks ago, was it 5 weeks ago now, basically from one day to the next, Russian television switched from rescuing the brothers in Ukraine to rescuing the Syrians from the Americans. They just turned the page, dramatically from one. And I think Syria in Russian domestic politics is that happy foreign story. So, Russian politics is basically about the media. Putin needs some kind of happy story because in the real world of Russia, right, things aren't going so well. And so I think that's one way of explaining what's happening.